So while all these problems with Phoenix were growing, IBM, which was the main firm in charge of implementing the system, was never really held responsible for any of the problems. And the government kept extending the firm's contract and IBM kept getting paid more and more. It was sort of in so deep and they had to rely on IBM to do all this. And so the contract in the end was amended 39 times. And it was supposed to be a cost savings initiative, but it actually ended up costing the public a lot. So it shows this relationship between firms and governments, how reliant and entangled it can get.
Welcome to Perspectives, a Canadian journal of political economy and social democracy. I'm Clement Nokos, editor of Perspectives Journal and director of policy at the Broadbent Institute. Earlier in spring 2024, the federal government announced that it was parting ways with the Phoenix Pay system, the infamous payroll system that unreliably paid out the paychecks of public service workers across Canada. The program, which snowballed to a total cost of more than $4 billion after more than a decade, was propped up over the years by both Liberal and Conservative governments, and put federal public sector workers in a precarious state for years. Meanwhile, the Phoenix System's parent company, IBM, continued to receive government contracts for drawn-out, ineffective work. This multi-billion-dollar scandal is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to how much the private sector consulting industry has latched onto public administrations to cash out while undermining our social services and democratic accountability. To learn more about the nebulous Canadian consulting industry, how we got here, and where we're going, I sat down with Hurl and Leah Werner, authors of The Consulting Trap: How Professional Service Firms Hook Governments and Undermine Democracy. Hurl teaches sociology and anthropology at Concordia University, where Werner is a PhD candidate. In The Consulting Trap, Hurl and Werner track the malpractices brought on by Transnational Public Service Firms, or TPSFs, the longhand name for professional service firms at the crossroads of consulting, auditing, and information technology services. Their book shows how companies like McKinsey, Deloitte, and KPMG have popularized dubious financial models and metrics that legitimize the high costs of privately financed infrastructures. In other words, private consultants have played a role in enriching the powerful through cuts and corruption, all while de-skilling civil servants, eroding democratic institutions, and weakening public services. The Consulting Trap's case studies demonstrate how the nebulous global consulting industry has subsumed itself within the public sectors of advanced industrial economies, and to answer why we are left with malfunctioning public services at higher costs, I'd like to welcome Chris and Leah to the Perspectives Journal podcast.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks so much. Happy to be here.
I'm sure when many Canadians think of what's wrong with their federal government, they think of programs and services that feel broken, like the Phoenix Pay system saga or more recent failures like the ArriveCan app. These are certainly pieces of information technology that people blame the government for as billion-dollar boondoggles. But in your work, you point to the nebulous consulting industry in Canada as the real culprits for this highway robbery. Why are the consultants to blame? And should we still be blaming the government, really, for these scandals?
That's a great question, and I think one that really goes to the heart of the argument in our book, which is that governments like the Canadian one have really been caught in what we call a consulting trap. And so the problem is not just consultants per se. We don't want to portray them as these puppet masters pulling the strings while governments are these helpless actors along for the ride. It's definitely important to recognize that governments are to blame. They do have a role to play in this problem. They could do more to uphold certain standards. We see, for example, in the recent ArriveCan scandal that you mentioned, how they flout procurement rules. And we also know that there are certain interests within governments because of connections and networks that favor certain firms. So governments do have a role, but then that being said, the problem goes deeper. And one of the things we really want to show in the book is how these firms have become entrenched in the day-to-day operations of governments, how the problem is really structural. So the reason why governments keep turning to these firms despite scandal after scandal, and to understand why they've become so powerful in the public sector, we need to take a step back and really understand the changing shape of the industry. So the scope and scale of their operations is really notable. They employ millions of employees and operate in hundreds of offices around the world. And they've also grown very rapidly. For example, McKinsey's workforce has nearly doubled over the last 13 years. Deloitte has tripled in size over the last 16 years, and the list goes on. And in terms of scope, they're also not just operating as consulting firms anymore. They call themselves professional service firms, which is what we refer to them as in the book. And they've really increasingly spread out into different areas. The big four auditing firms, for example, Deloitte, EY, PwC, and KPMG are not just doing auditing anymore. They do strategy consulting, and they're also doing a lot of IT infrastructure, investing heavily in cloud computing and rolling out these governance platforms for public administration. So while maybe a lot of people don't think of them like this, we can actually really compare them to like the big tech platforms like Amazon, Google, and Apple in their power and their scope. And through this, they've kind of been able to like really embed themselves in the operations of government. The Phoenix pay system kind of saga or scandal is a good example of this happening at the expense of the public. So while all these problems with Phoenix were growing, IBM, which was the main firm in charge of implementing the system, was never really held responsible for any of the problems. And the government kept extending the firm's contract, and IBM kept getting paid more and more. It was sort of in so deep, and they had to rely on IBM to do all this. And so the contract in the end was amended 39 times. And it was supposed to be a cost savings initiative, but it actually ended up costing the public a lot. So it shows this relationship between firms and governments, how reliant and entangled it can get, and also that it's not an equal kind of relationship. It's often asymmetrical. The firms are often the ones that come out in favor, and their motives, right, and their aim is profit, and that often happens at the public expense.
And, just to be clear, we're not saying governments aren't also to blame for this, because if you look at the Auditor General's reports for the McKinsey case or for ArriveCan, you'll see that they completely ignored the established procurement principles in terms of how they went about selecting these firms. They completely ignored the established practices that were supposed to be implemented. And the Treasury Board officials even said they even know who was responsible for implementing those principles in practice, right? So there is a big government fail there, right? And, to some extent that has always been the issue. But in our book, we wanted to talk about how as a changing structural relationship between consulting firms and governments. And that is reflected in the changing scope and scale of these firms and how they operate, because they're not just ad hoc advisors anymore, just being parachuted in to give advice on one-off kind of basis. Increasingly, they are providing these infrastructures. And as they do, and as governments become reliant on these infrastructures, then it can be very difficult for governments to extricate themselves from these relationships. It's easy to get entrenched in terms of how these firms operate, which makes it very difficult to change or correct their behavior over time. In the end, they often just get rewarded for their failures, and they dig themselves deeper and deeper in as they go, as we see with Phoenix.
We think of it sort of as a vicious cycle. The more governments become reliant on these firms, the worse it gets. It's this kind of self-perpetuating cycle.
Speaking of this vicious cycle, that's it looks like it's kind of been going on for a very, very long time. As you detail in your brief history of the consulting industry, you point to the 1911 origins of Taylorism and the principles of scientific management, where American engineer Frederick Taylor popularized engineering principles in public management, the sort of new public management ethos. This traces itself into the rise of neoliberalism and the decline of universalist post-war regimes towards more technocratic administrations by the late 20th century. So how does the consulting trap then figure into the rise of neoliberalism in the Anglo-American countries like Canada and across Western Europe?
So that's a very big question. Basically, in the book, we talked about how the consulting firms were really instrumental in rolling out many of the core programs associated with neoliberalism. And we focus on 4 core areas. We look at auditing, we look at privatization, we look at financialization, and we look at tax avoidance. And if you're looking at the early history of neoliberalism, you can see how the big consulting firms were really instrumental in facilitating the shift to neoliberal regimes right from the beginning, with the implementation of performance-based audit regimes in the 70s, which significantly expanded the mandate of audits. Previously, audits had been much more of a bookkeeping procedure that was focused on just kind of ensuring accountability on the outside. But with the development of new kinds of auditing practices to expand the mandate of audits from just bookkeeping to really a practice that enabled day-to-day governance. And so we see them getting much more focused on developing metrics, tracking efficiency, looking for areas of cost savings. And as a part of that, they were centrally involved in the process of computerization from the 70s onwards, because if you want to actually implement these kinds of new auditing frameworks, which they've developed, you also need to have technologies and data infrastructures that are able to actually keep track of that data. So they were very centrally architects in terms of developing the way that metrics were used in managing performance, as well as the computerization systems through which the day-to-day assessments were actually implemented. But then beyond that, we can also look at how they were centrally involved in privatization from the early days, right? If you want to go back to Thatcher's England, right, they were very instrumental in brokering deals between the public and private sector for the privatization of state-owned enterprise in energy, rail, water. If you look at the Global South, they've been centrally involved in structural adjustment programs. They're often mandated by the World Bank and IMF. They're required by governments to take on consultants in order to implement structural adjustment programs, which enable the sell-off of state-owned enterprises. If you look at the post-socialist world, Deloitte was the central project manager in enabling the privatization of state-owned enterprises in Russia and Poland. PricewaterhouseCoopers, Arthur Andersen were centrally involved in the privatization of services in East Germany, right? And they started out as financial advisors brokering deals, but over time, they began positioning themselves as policy advisors in terms of not just advising on the specific deals, but actually advocating for privatization as a policy. And they were really central in establishing the advocacy associations that we saw cropping up around the world through the 80s and 90s that were really pressing for privatization as a policy option. And from there, they went on to advance a program of financialization, which meant transforming public services that couldn't be easily privatized into assets that outside investors could speculate on and extract rents from. And there we can see the central role of the big consulting firms in popularizing programs like public-private partnerships and social impact bonds. And then we wanted to also talk about tax avoidance, because that is also something that's going on in the background. And very often when people talk about taxes, they talk about it as something as an independent problem from consulting. But we also need to recognize how these big consulting firms some of these firms have been the central architects of tax avoidance around the world, which has led to the loss of billions of dollars of revenues for governments. And really, what we do in the book is look at how these different programs interact in a way that fosters the deepening neoliberalization of governments over time, right? So with tax avoidance, you have governments losing money, losing revenue, which periodically culminates in fiscal crises. In fiscal crises, who do governments call in? Well, they call in these firms. These firms then advise governments on where to cut costs. And as they're providing their recommendations, they invariably recommend privatization. And very often, and increasingly, we're seeing that these firms are increasingly getting in on the privatization game by actually providing privatized, outsourced administrative infrastructures to governments, which often end up costing governments far more than they would have cost in-house to begin with. So that creates a vicious cycle that is also a part of the consulting trap that we discussed in the book.
Yeah, and I guess you said it really well, Chris, and I guess you can add that within a lot of these programs, they also create for themselves kind of ongoing businesses that are sort of often written into the creation of these programs. You see it, for example, with private-public partnerships that you mentioned, Chris, that they've been really central in advocating for, and they really popularized the narrative around PPPs. And so what has happened is that within this process, they also place themselves, as central intermediaries, and that creates this lucrative ongoing business that then the governments keep hiring them, which is just another example of this cycle, right?
In the way that you describe this cycle, I mean, it does bring to mind, things like racketeering, kind of creating the environment where you're able to exploit, especially if it's governments that you're advising. Being the architects of your own profiteering is kind of a kind of a crazy thing to think about, especially when we see, profits go up, especially after the pandemic, and just seeing how much money these companies are making. And this sort of thing is out in the open. What I always find useful is, taking a cursory look at just how much the federal government, for instance, spends on consultants. You can just look at the Open Canada search function for federal government contracts over $10,000 on Open Canada. Just Google that, and you can find it really easily. And in that database, if you type in the search for things, say like McKinsey or Deloitte, you'll find multi-million-dollar contracts and the government departments that procured them. And what they're really for, it's hard to tell coming from just the database entries. And as a previous civil servant myself, it's sometimes hard to figure out what it is these companies are actually doing in these federal government departments. I mean, aside from the high-profile scandals, could you tell us what, elaborate more what these contracts are actually for? What do they actually do in the Canadian federal government context and elsewhere in other public administrations across the country?
No, it is really hard to know exactly what they do and to figure it out. And I think we also see that as part of the problem, right? There's a huge lack of transparency in their work with governments. Yeah, these contracts are often classified as professional and special services. And what does that mean? There are often no details. It's really hard to figure out what it falls under. It's hard to know what their methods are. Even in their outputs, they rarely have to report on their methods and their operations. So there's this air of mystery. One thing to look at is in terms of their outputs in strategy consulting is their PowerPoint decks. But I think even that, it's kind of rarely transparent in terms of what actually goes into the study. They do a lot of comparing, sometimes or often unclear why they pick the places they do. And so that makes it really hard to also assess their work. This has also been criticized by the Auditor General of Canada several times, that it's due to this lack of transparency. It's really difficult to actually assess whether value for money has been achieved. And so a lot of the time also, with some exceptions, the advice or programs that they sell to governments are these ready-made, ready-to-go solutions or recipes that don't necessarily correspond to local needs or local context where they're sort of selling them to. And they also rarely consult with those affected by their programs or their advice. And that's a real problem. As to what they do, you can also look beyond strategy consulting. And I think Chris mentioned it before as well. These firms are also assuming larger responsibility for delivering core services and some of the core infrastructure of governance. You have outsourcing firms like Capita and Serco, G4S, who self-describe as experts in delivering outsourced essential public services. They run prison and detention centers in the UK and Australia. They've helped administer parts of Obamacare in the US. In Canada, they've been hired by the Ontario government to manage part of the job training program for people on social assistance, where they gain profit based on how many people that they can get back to work, which is a problematic model, definitely. And in terms of the core infrastructure, it's these IT platforms and IT infrastructures that they sell to governments. The Phoenix Pay system is an example. The ArriveCan app, which is a whole scandal in itself, was an example of that. And we also saw it during COVID pandemic, when these firms were widely hired for a whole range of things in Canada. And we talk about they managed Quebec's vaccination rollout. And we also talk about how in the UK, and this is sort of, I guess, an extreme example, but still one that shows some of these dynamics. In the UK, Deloitte was hired to manage the COVID test and trace system, and this sort of included a lot, managing test centers, appointment bookings, laboratories, collecting statistics, et cetera, et cetera. And so there were so many problems with the system. It was well documented in the media. It was many scandals came out of it. The test results of the NHS staff was being lost into the wrong person. Deloitte wasn't collecting key data, wasn't sharing testing data with local health authorities. NHS staff were waiting 7 days to receive their COVID-19 results, where local labs could have done it in 6 hours. But it didn't really matter, and the government just kept billing out money to them. At one point, the ratio of consultant to civil services working for test and trace was 1-to-1, and the average rate for a test and trace consultant was £1,000 per day, with some billing over £6,000 per day. So that's obviously a huge amount, again, for these kind of services that are, kind of unknown what they actually do, and a lot of the times are really faulty.
I think it's important to note that obviously the field is really diverse in terms of what consultants do, and there's a lot of different kinds of consulting firms. We really just focus on the big players in the book, and when we're classifying the different kinds of actors, we focus on 4 different kinds, right? So we talk about strategy consultants, which is probably something that your listeners are most familiar with, right? In terms of when you think about consultants, this is what they do. So strategy consultants, these are folks like McKinsey that assess the kinds of services that you provide against benchmarks, best practices taken from agencies that are seen as kind of world-leading kinds of institutions. But then there's also the auditing firms, which we've already discussed, right? So PwC, Deloitte, KPMG, EY, these firms are often seen as auditing firms, but they are actually very central players in the consulting market now, I think actually eclipsing McKinsey in terms of the total revenue that they get from consulting. They're the biggest consulting firms in the world. And then we talk about IT outsourcing, right? So this gets into IBM, Microsoft, the Phoenix example, who really take a lot of work focused on the implementation of IT platforms, often in partnership with McKinsey, in partnership with the auditing firms. I believe that in the Phoenix example, IBM, McKinsey was later brought in to advise on how to fix the IBM mess. Often there's partnerships between them, but there's an overlap between these areas with the big accounting firms also getting into IT consulting. The last area we talk about is outsourcing firms. And these are firms like Capita and Serco, very far from strategy consulting, right? Where it is more of a one-off kind of relationship where they give advice in a specific moment, provide a report. With the outsourcing firms, they are much more focused on providing the day-to-day administration of different government services, often through their own kinds of data infrastructures, administrative platforms. And I think the thing that we want to highlight in the book is that these 4 areas, there's a convergence between them increasingly, especially over the past few years, as folks engaged in strategy consulting, auditing, IT platforms also want to get in on the day-to-day administrative work. And beyond the PowerPoint decks and the strategy consultants kind of operating at that level, I think it's really also important to recognize that there's a lot of temporary labor in the government, especially in a context where governments often put restrictions on the number of permanent staff that you can employ. And in that context, different public agencies will often turn to consultants just to do really mundane administrative work like Leah describes during the pandemic, day-to-day work that doesn't really require any special expertise from these firms, but which these firms charge just a ridiculous amount of money for, when you could pay a public sector worker far less to do the same kind of work, which is just mundane administrative stuff, right? So I hope that captures the range of activities that they're engaged in.
This is very much a labor issue as much as it is an issue of democracy and democratic control. And in the book, you suggest to retake democratic control back from these consulting firms. You lay out examples of where citizens have organized against them. I will say that also, since the Stephen Harper era, to play catch up with the cuts and austerity across the federal public service during his administration, the Trudeau government grew the public service to make up for some of those deficiencies, those gaps where, people were shipped in at higher costs to do these mundane administrative jobs. But as we've also seen with recent actions such as last year's PSAC and QP campaigns bargaining for better wages, unionized workers have also become a strong force within the public service. Meanwhile, still these checks are being written out to the TPSFs. And I know from experience that this outsourcing has led to de-skilling, lower value of in-house expertise. And eventually, you have a bit of a brain drain. You have talent exiting from the civil service. How should labor actually play a role in pushing back against the consulting trap?
Yeah, in our book, we talk about different ways in which people can resist these firms. If you see these firms coming into your public service and you're concerned with the kind of advice that they're going to provide, we provide people with strategies that they can use to challenge their power. And we see this as a real contribution in the book because there's a lot of policy literature out there on consultants and the procurement process, but there isn't really that much on how people are challenging the power or credibility of these firms. And people are doing that, but it's just not being really talked about very much. So we wanted to provide some examples of where this is being done. And we focus on citizens groups, and we focus on 4 areas, 4 strategies that people can engage in. One is people's audits. That means actively seeking to get access to the financial documents, the contracts, related kinds of documents that have been taken up in the procurement process, interrogating them line by line. We also talked about social network analysis, where there are groups that are actively seeking out information about who is exactly responsible for providing these consultations, where are they coming from, who are their clients, right? Are there any conflicts of interest in terms of how they're operating? We also talk about access to information as a central area of struggle. As Leah mentioned, it's really difficult to know what these firms are doing, and we're seeing different groups creatively engaging in access to information processes to try to get access to some of the outputs that consultants are producing, figuring out the methods that they engage in. And finally, consultation. So interjecting in the consultation process itself, demanding inclusion as public sector workers, public sector users in the process of consultation, being able to provide feedback, but also developing your own kinds of consultation processes if you're being locked out of the process. And we focused on citizens groups there, but I think it's really important to note that labor unions have also been at the forefront of this. And so here in Canada, TIPS has been really central in keeping track of the contracts. For example, if you go to their website, they produced a few great reports that use open data, proactive disclosures, MERCs to really get a sense of how much is being spent, where the contracts are going, this sort of thing. There are also labor unions have been at the forefront in demanding access to information. I know QP has been doing a lot of work in trying to open the doors around public-private partnerships, for instance, because the valuation of public-private partnerships is really unclear, and big consulting firms are responsible for that process, but we don't have any sense of their methodology or how they actually come up with their numbers. The unions have been really pushing for that. And they've also been really pushing to open the doors for consultation. An interesting case in the UK is that how the public sector unions are they've developed really sophisticated research teams that have been able to systematically challenge the claims to value for money that are being advanced by these firms in the competitive tendering process, where in the UK, at a lot of places, you have to open up contracts to private bidders. And there's a struggle that takes place in terms of demonstrating the value that you're going to bring. And very often these consulting firms will completely paper over, provide zero evidence about the kinds of claims they're making. And labor unions have been really central in interrogating that and challenging the value claims made by these firms. So absolutely When we're looking at resistance, I think we can look at how unions can take some of the same methods that we discussed in the book, but also unions are occupying a really privileged position in some ways that other groups do not, to the extent that, first of all, they can see what's happening directly in the labor process, how consultants are directly impacting the labor process through their advice, through the kinds of work that they provide. They're often privy to a lot of information that other people are not. So I think that's important to consider. And it's also important to consider how unions can challenge this through collective agreements and the grievance process, right? So entrenching strong language in collective agreements that kind of puts limits on outsourcing, really restricts where outsourcing can take place, and then grieving it if public agencies start reaching out to consultants in those areas.
Lastly, as you pointed out throughout the conversation, TPSFs in Canada's civil service are actually a global phenomenon, with examples from the US and how the UK became the testing ground for their expansion into Western Europe during the post-war period. And we've seen the headlines. These same companies are doing the same things in South Africa, in Brazil, all over the global South. You'll find the same usual suspects in a lot of these corruption cases that are being prosecuted all over the world. How does the Canadian case compare to the global scale of the problem? And, you know, it's not just in Canada. How should we be addressing the problem around the world?
So, yes, absolutely. I think we should be seeing this as a global kind of problem, a global phenomenon. If we look at it at a global level, we can see how the largest consulting firms are powerful actors to the extent that they're able to act as curators of information across jurisdictions. This is a central kind of argument we make in the book. When we're looking at consulting firms in terms of what they do, they act as curators, go-betweens, brokering access to information between jurisdictions. And along these lines, I think we should see Canada as a specific kind of site. At Canadian governments, it's specific institutional settings that are part of a global network in which consulting knowledge circulates. And in some ways, we're on the receiving end. So, for example, if you look at public-private partnerships, right, we can see how public-private partnership policies were first developed in the UK, and then consulting firms were really instrumental in taking those policies from the UK and bringing them into Canada. But then Canada is also an important supplier of consulting knowledge, and they're really responsible for exporting a lot of these ideas to other parts of the world. And if we return to the public-private partnership case, we can see how while public-private partnerships they've been really widely discredited in the UK, in Canada they've kind of taken up the torch. And consulting firms were really central in establishing the Canadian Council for Public-Private Partnerships here, which is a very central kind of organization now in diffusing public-private partnerships around the world. And if you go to their conferences, they have annual conferences every year, you can see how Canadian consulting knowledge is being mobilized there then to promote projects and push for the implementation of public-private partnerships in Latin America, in the Caribbean countries. So this is a global network, right? And we only really focused in Canada in the book because that's where our research was focused. And these firms are so huge, it's hard to really get a sense of exactly how they're operating everywhere. But we just wanted to take a start with Canada. But how we see Canada in this context is that we see it as a node in this network. So consulting knowledge is flowing through Canada, to Canada from other places, and then from Canada to other places. In terms of considering the problem and how to resolve it, I think returning to the idea that these firms are curators, right? Looking at the power that curators have. I think that curators are powerful precisely to the extent that they can be selective in deciding on the kinds of data that they disclose, right? They can curate that information. They don't need to let you know exactly where they're getting it from or what access to knowledge they have, right? And I think this is a major problem. The transparency of these firms in terms of where they get their knowledge from, where they get their data from, is really lacking. And I think we need to question the rigor consulting firms in terms of their outputs, to the extent that they don't need to provide their methodologies, they don't need to provide their data sets or explain their findings. to outside actors, right? I think a good way to look at this is to liken it to academia, right? In academia, we have a peer review process, right? In terms of the research that we do, how it's funded, how it's evaluated, right? We have to produce research outputs, which then get vetted through a peer review process. Our peers, people in other universities, they'll look at our work and they'll assess it. And they'll look at our methodologies, they'll look at our data, they'll look at how we analyze our data. And if there's anything lacking, they'll call us out on it. They'll be like, you're missing this. You're lacking this methodology. You overlooked this. In consulting, there's none of that. There's like zero oversight of consulting and consulting outputs. If you look at consulting, it's often thought of as a profession, but it's not a profession. It's not credentialized. You don't need to have credentials to be a consultant. There's no professional body that's responsible for overseeing your work. In terms of consulting outputs, very little is disclosed in terms of what your methodologies are, what your findings are. So in this context, at the global level, we need a lot more transparency in terms of who these firms are and how they're acting. And there's a couple of areas where reforms are needed. I think one is in terms of looking at the structure of these firms and how they're organized themselves. So many of these firms are not publicly traded companies. They're referred to as limited liability partnerships. And so they have a lot fewer requirements in terms of what they report, right? With publicly traded companies, there's a lot of reporting requirements in terms of where you're operating, what your revenues are, right? You need to provide that information to shareholders so they can get a sense of what they're investing in. Most consulting firms don't operate that way. As limited liability partnerships, they're really not required to disclose much at all in terms of how they operate. In the case of McKinsey, very famously, they don't even disclose their client list. And in that context, it's impossible to even determine whether there are conflicts of interest with the organization, right? You can't see, oh, hey, I am a government that's interested in restructuring drug approvals as they did in the United States. It might be useful information to know that your major client is also Purdue, right? So they don't need to disclose that. In terms of consulting outputs, I think it's also important to demand access to consulting outputs, because while we have access to contracts through things like open data, through proactive disclosures, we seldom get access to the actual stuff that consulting firms are producing. And there's an interesting article from a think tank in Australia I read where they were arguing, like, as a matter of course, when we're hiring consultants, we shouldn't just be getting access to contracts. We should also see what they're actually producing. And in that process, we should be able to provide it the kind of review and assessment that we see in other areas in terms of due diligence, right? In terms of academia, in terms of peer review. We should be able to have a peer review process with the consulting process where we can actively appraise these outputs and investigate, interrogate the validity of their criteria, their methodology, their findings.
And I guess just to, finish off, these are really important points. It represents such a massive amount of money, right? And it also affects so many people in their day-to-day. Like when you look at what they do, even though that's really mysterious, as we've talked about, they represent these ideologies, right? These programs that often actually harm people and kind of adversely affect the quality of services. And so I think absolutely, it's a global problem. And I think when we were doing the research, it's also it's so difficult, like, to get a sense of both what they do and how, like, their operations, as Chris was talking about, like, and we spend a lot of time doing research, right? So for people who are not researchers in the area, and it's so difficult to wrap your head around, right? Which is also a part of the problem. One of the sort of problems, I think, is also the narrative that a lot of these firms have helped to propagate. And I think it's part of it is also sort of challenging that narrative, changing that narrative. Not that that's an easy task, but I think that's also an important part, because it really does affect people in their daily lives, what these firms do. It's a big problem.
That was Chris Hurl and Leah B. Werner, authors of The Consulting Trap: How Professional Service Firms Hook Governments and Undermine Democracy. You can read a review of The Consulting Trap by the Broadbent Institute's own Jack McClelland, now online and coming soon to our print number 2 issue of the Perspectives Journal. And if you like this interview, share and subscribe to Perspectives, a Canadian journal of political economy and social democracy, on all major podcast platforms, as well as Press Progress's Sources podcast that digs deeper into the news stories you won't find in the major papers. The Perspectives Journal podcast and Sources are proud members of the Harbinger Media Network, Canada's progressive podcast community. You can read more in Perspectives Journal, a publication of the Broadbent Institute, by visiting perspectivesjournal.ca.